Modern hustle culture preaches that extreme intermittent fasting is the ultimate biological hack for elite productivity. Clinical neurobiology tells a much darker, highly classified story. Forcing the biological machine into extended periods of starvation does not optimize the brain. It triggers a massive, prehistoric survival response. Floods the hippocampus with highly acidic cortisol, violently accelerates cellular senescence, and mathematically guarantees premature cognitive aging. By the conclusion of this clinical analysis, the exact metabolic protocols the global elite use to prevent neural decay will be fully exposed. Leaving this data unexamined ensures the organism will continue to sacrifice its fluid intelligence for a toxic illusion of discipline. The modern professional operates under a catastrophic misunderstanding of evolutionary biology. Society equates the physical sensation of an empty stomach with mental sharpness and superiority. However, analyzing this behavior through the lens of human evolution reveals a fatal systemic error. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain evolved in an immediate return environment, where securing the next meal and avoiding starvation were the only metrics of survival. The biological machine is entirely hardwired to perceive a severe lack of calories not as a lifestyle choice, but as a critical, life-threatening famine. When a highly driven individual intentionally starves themselves for 16, 20, or 24 hours to conform to a digital trend, they believe they are unlocking a higher level of focus. In reality, they are manually activating the brain's deepest fear circuitry. The central nervous system cannot distinguish between an intentional biohack and an actual geographic famine. The brain, representing just 2% of total body mass but consuming 20% of its finite metabolic energy, is the first organ to detect this severe caloric deficit. To protect the organism from imminent death, the brain initiates a profound homeostatic shift. It aggressively downregulates higher-order cognitive functions, such as complex problem-solving, long-term strategic planning, and emotional regulation, rerouting all remaining energy exclusively toward immediate survival protocols. The individual assumes they're focused, entirely blind to the fact that their capacity for deep, analytical labor has already been neurologically disabled. Why chronic hunger spikes cortisol? The devastating impact of severe dietary restriction becomes undeniable when measuring the microscopic chemical responses of the cerebral cortex. The human brain fundamentally operates as a prediction machine, continuously scanning the internal and external environment to anticipate physical threats. When caloric fuel is chronically restricted, the hypersensitive amygdala detects a severe drop in premium glucose. This detection instantly triggers the hypothalamic-pituitary-adrenal axis, the biological alarm system of the human body. In a desperate attempt to liberate stored energy, the nervous system floods the bloodstream with toxic, highly elevated levels of cortisol and adrenaline. The organism biologically prepares for a brutal physical battle to hunt for food that never actually occurs. The metabolic cost of this false alarm is monumental. The brain aggressively burns through its remaining cellular adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, simply to sustain the infinite anxiety loop generated by the cortisol spike. The feeling of being wired or sharp during a long fast is not a marker of superior intellect. It is a clinical state of hyperarousal driven purely by stress hormones. It is the exact same neurological state an animal experiences moments before being attacked by a predator. Once this artificial, stress-driven energy is completely depleted, the organism experiences a violent cognitive crash. The professional feels physically decimated, highly irritable, and utterly exhausted. This paralysis is not a failure of character. It is a measurable clinical energy deficit caused by self-imposed starvation. The biology of cellular panic. The degradation of cognitive performance is not a temporary psychological weakness. It is a permanent, physical deterioration of cellular architecture. In the study of biological longevity and medicine 3, the preservation of mitochondrial density is the ultimate metric of human performance. Mitochondria are the microscopic powerhouses responsible for generating clean ATP within the brain. However, chronic metabolic stress from continuous extreme fasting actively degrades these critical structures. The highly acidic nature of constant cortisol exposure physically attacks the neural pathways required for high-level analytical thought. The organism is actively sacrificing its own biological longevity to sustain an artificial trend. This cellular decay frequently goes unnoticed because of a concept known in behavioral psychology as the plateau of latent potential. Destructive processes often remain hidden for long periods before crossing a critical threshold. Cancer, for example, spends 80% of its life entirely undetectable before taking over the body in a matter of months. Similarly, the neurological damage caused by chronic starvation accumulates invisibly. The individual feels fine for the first few months of their extreme fasting protocol. They attribute any minor brain fog to lack of sleep or corporate stress. But beneath the surface, the chronic lack of premium metabolic fuel is forcing the brain cells into a state of premature senescence. The biological machine is rusting from the inside out, silently losing its capacity for fluid intelligence long before the external symptoms of memory loss and severe mental fatigue become obvious. How fasting prematurely ages the brain. To understand how starvation destroys human leverage, one must analyze the precise division of cognitive labor within the central nervous system. Clinical psychologists divide human cognition into two distinct categories, System 1 and System 2. System 1 is the fast, non-conscious, highly emotional and reactive portion of the brain. It requires very little caloric energy to function. System 2 is the slow, conscious, highly rational and analytical portion of the brain. It is the biological center of true intellectual leverage, and it requires a massive, continuous supply of glucose and ATP to operate. Behavioral biology dictates that the human brain naturally evolved to conserve precious energy at all costs, adhering strictly to the law of least effort. When an organism is subjected to the chronic stress of extreme fasting, the prefrontal cortex, the home of System 2, violently drains its finite energy reserves, simply attempting to suppress natural hunger signals. Because the brain is starving, it forcefully shuts down System 2 to prevent total energetic collapse. Instantly, the primitive, highly emotional System 1 hijacks the central nervous system. The professional completely loses the neurological capacity to make rational, long-term decisions. They become highly reactive, easily frustrated, and entirely incapable of enduring the friction of complex problem-solving. Furthermore, the elevated cortisol levels associated with chronic hunger physically shrink the hippocampus, the exact geometric region responsible for spatial memory and learning. By repeatedly practicing the act of starvation, the individual is biologically hardwiring their own brain to operate purely on fear and emotion, systematically erasing their capacity for logic. Overrestriction is an active self-sabotage protocol that prematurely ages the cognitive machinery, rendering the individual functionally less intelligent with every passing year. Why the elite refuse to starve? This horrific cognitive decay creates a cycle of artificial superiority that completely masks the terrifying reality of severe neural starvation. The illusion of progress is the absolute most dangerous component of the fasting glitch. When a dysregulated nervous system cannot exert control over complex external variables, such as scaling a business or mastering a difficult skill, it retreats to controlling the easiest internal variable, food intake. The individual becomes hopelessly addicted to the restriction phase. They confuse the friction of hunger with forward momentum. However, the top 1% of global performers, the true intellectual elite, operate on a frequency that directly contradicts this modern advice. They do not seek to starve themselves. They engineer environments of absolute metabolic abundance. They understand that relying on heroic willpower to ignore hunger is a catastrophic biological strategy. The people with the best self-control are typically the ones who need to use it the least. They structure their lives in a way that does not require constantly battling their own survival instincts. The elite recognize that every ounce of energy spent fighting hunger is an ounce of energy stolen from their creative and analytical output. Therefore, they completely eliminate this friction. They ruthlessly provide their biological machine with high-quality, dense nutrients, ensuring their cortisol levels remain at absolute baseline and their ATP production operates at maximum capacity. They do not optimize for the aesthetic illusion of an empty stomach. They optimize for the devastating intellectual leverage of a fully fueled brain. Engineering optimal brain fuel. To permanently eradicate this biological glitch, the individual must transition from being a passive victim of modern diet culture to becoming the supreme architect of their own metabolic reality. True cognitive dominance requires fueling the biological machine with the exact precision of a high-performance engine. The preservation of cellular ATP and the fierce protection of the hippocampus are the ultimate metrics of long-term success. This requires the implementation of strict environmental design. The organism must be provided with clean, predictable fuel so the conscious mind is completely freed from the burden of artificial scarcity. When the brain is no longer forced to process the continuous, low-grade trauma of starvation, massive reserves of metabolic energy are instantly liberated. This preserved ATP is immediately redirected toward deep memory consolidation, hyperdense analytical labor, and unparalleled professional execution. Society heavily profits by keeping the masses permanently paralyzed by extreme diet trends, drowning in endless restriction while their fluid intelligence slowly evaporates. The entire consumer economy monetizes the exhaustion of the human mind. But true systemic leverage requires the ruthless clinical elimination of all metabolic friction. The biological machine must be fed so the prefrontal cortex can conquer. Now, the critical question remains for you. Are your fasting habits actually sharpening your focus, or are you secretly accelerating the decay of your own neurons just to maintain the illusion of elite discipline? If this classified breakdown exposed the hidden damage in your system, subscribe and activate the notification bell. The global elite do not starve their potential. They fuel the machine and they execute.